Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, so you didn't see all of the units on one?
No.
Oh, this is really good from yesterday.
All right, everybody, we'll get starting a little bit late. I think there's going to be, can I ask a favor?
I know how many people
Do you know Elizabeth Nelson? Okay. Yeah, PhD student. Yeah, just text her. Or, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Text her. Just tell her that, the people, just to come in from the modeling class, right? They should just, come in. Okay, good. Okay, so, Bob, I think we're going to get started. Yeah, good. All right. Well, today we have really, it's an unfortunate snowy day because, as you know, most people, now one thing that we're trying to get used to at Yale is how to live in the post-pandemic world with hybrid systems and so forth. But the snow certainly didn't help. But hopefully there's going to be a stream of students coming in right after their mathematical modeling course. So, all right, good. But anyway, today is a special day that we have. Charity Dean was coming to talk to us, and I think many of you may have read Michael Lewis's book Premonition, and it really kind of illustrates an important, I think, learning experience for us here at Yale and academics, where we get to meet people who actually have been part of history, who made history, and who can tell us about it, but also tell us what we need to do in the future. And we have a good example today with Charity coming here. Charity is a medical doctor, initially trained as a surgeon, then went into internal medicine, served as the public health director of the Santa Barbara County Department of Health, and then rose in the California State Health Department to become the medical director, so the second highest position. And really had an illustrious career as a public health practitioner. Then bringing us into the California, during the pandemic, was one of the first to lead the charge against COVID, as well as being the co-chair of the COVID-19 task force for California, and was in the thick of it, and will tell us that story. But then in the middle of the pandemic, we're actually still in the early stages, actually went and pursued her passion, of really identifying the key gaps that we encountered in the early stages of the pandemic by setting up the Public Health Company, which is a venture capital-based technology or technology startup, to really kind of address some of the key issues that we've been addressing, dealing with now as well as in the early stages of the pandemic. So, we're going to have a reception afterwards, and I really, this is a fascinating individual. This is somebody that students can learn a lot from about public health, and I just encourage everyone to just, talk to her and get some wisdom about, especially the young ones, thinking about careers in public health. So thank you very much, Charity, for visiting us.
Thank you for hosting. It was such a pleasure. I got to visit one of his classes yesterday, Outbreak Investigations. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. Students ask the best questions. They're so thoughtful. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a little bit of my background first and let you know kind of the direction that we're going here. As Albert said, I served as local health officer and then at the state of California. But I grew up in medicine starting out doing trauma surgery. So the way that I thought by the time I became local and then state health officer was like this: differential diagnosis with branching probabilistic algorithms, and you've got 3 seconds to make a decision, and it's all based on probabilities. Go. You're going to slice the patient open, you're going to amputate a leg. That quick decision making served really well in becoming a local and state health officer, where in public health, in disease control, it's very much like a battlefield on the front lines where you don't have tools, you don't have data. So through my experience as local health officer, my deep expertise is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and genomic epidemiology. But really my job was risk manager for the county. Fires, floods, air quality, disease was just one of the things. And so moving up to the state of California, it was the same thing. My job was the risk manager for the state, to tell the governor what to worry about, what was the risk, what could we do about it, and what actions and operational plans would I put in place. When Michael Lewis came and found me in June of 2020, I had no idea that I would be a character in the book. I thought my job was to teach him public health, because he was going to write the book about public health, about microbiology, and tell the story of how difficult this pandemic was and the system's failures. I read the book at the same time as everyone else and was shocked to see some of the stories in there. They are all true. And I'm going to share a few more stories through this talk today, because my real obsession, my lifelong obsession, is how do we build a system solution for the whole of the United States of America? How do we take this antiquated public health system, really started 200 years ago, that grew up organically, and create something for the 21st century? The technology available in Silicon Valley, the AI and ML capabilities today, have been leveraged in nearly every other sector. Nearly every other sector has turned humans into scalable software. Public health is like a time capsule, untouched by technology. And how heartening it's been through the pandemic to start to see that change. You know, there's hope everywhere. But what I envision is something even larger that could enable a whole of society response. So first, I want to talk through what the problem is, and everyone in this room knows the problem as well or better than I do, because we have all lived through it. And then talk through what a biosecurity system solution for the United States would look like. What are the foundational principles? What would that architecture look like? What are the dilemmas that we have? We're in a democracy. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I know a few of them. But constitutional dilemmas come into play when you're talking about health authorities. And what does that mean for what we can build today? And part of this, my disclosure, is I founded the public health company to build the solution. So when I talk about an intelligence platform, the reason why you haven't heard from me in 2 years, I kind of went dark after the book came out, so I went heads down to build it. And I'll show you a few slides. So I think of our country and our public health system as many scattered local health jurisdictions. There's about 3,200 of them. All the states, the business sectors, corporate enterprises, we have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of different nodes in this network that are disconnected. Not to mention our political views. And the country's, it's so incredibly polarized right now. That's a problem that has to be solved for too. So when I say out of many one, I love the concept of e pluribus unum, because in this country, we have faced incredibly difficult odds. We have found solutions. My God, we eradicated polio. We have done heroic moonshots in public health, and we did it by taking all these scattered data points, all these scattered nodes, and putting them into one. And I am convinced this is not impossible. This is hard, but this is not impossible. The Constitution, actually, I carry one for emergencies. Just kidding. Kind of. The Constitution talks about, in the very opening of the Constitution, that we provide for the common defense. But that's a dilemma, providing for the common defense, when we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of nodes. So what motivated me to look at this differently, there I was in California, running the operational response, was recognizing that as the risk manager for the state during a pandemic, this was not just about COVID. COVID was driving, so here we have disease, environment, climate, core infrastructure, roads, electrical grid, water systems, clean air, geopolitics, and population behavior. So a disease might be driving, but the world that we live in today, the threats are all intersecting. And I'll give you an example. At one point during COVID, thanks to climate change, we're seeing new kinds of natural disasters that swept through Louisiana. Well, it knocked out the electrical grid. Everyone had COVID in the hospital. The hospitals were already overflowing. They had to transfer patients to other hospitals. Another example is air quality events or heat events that happen in a pandemic. Well, protests are going on, and then the electrical grid goes down because of a fire. We live in a different world today, and the system we have was built for the last century. So what is the system we have? I love this system. I grew up in this system. I'm going to describe briefly the U.S. public health system as it existed pre-COVID. Improvements have been made, but this is largely the same. Of those 3,200 local health jurisdictions and the states, that does not include all the private employers, the soccer team, the churches, the nonprofits, the prisons, the jails, the organizations that function in every single community. So if you include those organizations in them, you can see how the antiquated system doesn't move fast enough. What I'm describing here is dots on a map. These are nodes. This might be a hospital, a school, essential workers at Walmart who are stocking the shelves. The way the system moves takes months for information to flow up and be disseminated out as intelligence. If you're familiar with the mandated reportable diseases at the state, I'll tell you that many times those are sent by snail mail. When I was a local health officer, I would get reports in an envelope handwritten by a doctor, a CMR report, reporting tuberculosis. Well, by the time I got that on my desk, that guy had been infectious with 4+ TB for 2 weeks out there, right? So the time delay that it takes to report is problematic, but it's also just how the system works right now. Faxes, phone calls, we're lucky if we can use emails, snail mail. So the local levels are the nodes where this starts, the local health jurisdictions. When a pediatrician is seeing a kiddo with a rash, or let's say 2 kids with a rash, they're going to notify the local health department of what they suspect. Let's say they suspect this is measles. The local health department, their node, are going to unidirectionally notify the state. They can pick up the phone and call their colleagues around them in counties, but there is no automated digital way to instantly share that intelligence. It's phone calls, it's emails, it's spreadsheets. So, for example, I was managing Santa Barbara County during the Disneyland measles outbreak. Does anyone remember that? 2014. We had measles suspects popping up all over the place, and we had to manage that via phone calls nationally. I was state health officer of California when the vaping illness first emerged. That was August. And how did we manage that? I was on the phone with Ohio, Iowa, Indiana. How many vaping cases do you have? How old are they? Well, what are you seeing? What are the clinical symptoms? It takes weeks to share information because there's no intelligence sharing capability. So as information moves through the system, it moves up to the state level. Now at the state level, their job is to aggregate the information, look for patterns. Do we have an outbreak? Do we have multiple different nodes with a threat? And support the front lines workers. You know, again, I like the battle analogy because it really does feel like wartime. The state's job is to support the front lines. But the information sharing to the state is very, very slow. The state then shares that with the CDC with an asterisk. States are not mandated, nor can they be. It's a constitutional issue. Others smarter than me can debate this. They cannot be mandated to share all of their data with the CDC. CDC doesn't have the authority. The federal government doesn't have the authority. The autonomy of states with their state data, they're really standalone. So the states share data with the CDC, but it's only for certain conditions, certain information. Oftentimes we anonymize it. Sometimes we share it in aggregate. So by the time CDC gets data, it's months old, it's incomplete, it's scattered, and it may only be partial or aggregated. So how does this overlap with the healthcare system? And how does this overlap with private businesses? Well, the reality is it doesn't. Public health has largely been built in a silo, and healthcare is largely in a silo. Some exceptions exist. Connecticut's one of them, so is Maryland. But by and large, this process flow exists in a silo in healthcare and a silo in public health. Well, what about essential workers at Home Depot or Tyson Foods, you know, or Target, or fill in the blank with any other, and airlines? Where are those companies in this system? They aren't. They aren't. All of the private sector, the essential workers, the employers they work for, they're left out of this. But let me just walk through briefly. And you know, a lot of this, I could tell some stories about COVID, scattered data. But a lot of this is based on phone calls, emails, fax machines, and spreadsheets. There's no platform with a shared reality. So data that turns into intelligence, and I wrote under here individual vigilance, because when I'm watching for a new threat emerging, when I'm watching for a new outbreak of MDR-TV, there is no automated workflow. There is no automated threat detection. It's me and my tiny human brain and my colleagues being vigilant to get the right diagnosis, call the public health department, report it up to the state. This is all done by humans. Now, our humans are amazing. Our humans are amazing, but any system built on human vigilance will fail. So the intelligence largely has been humans. Once we have intelligence, it leads to decisions. And the decisions and actions, this is true, healthcare, public health, the guy running Home Depot, the decisions and actions, oftentimes this is where decision makers will pause and say, well, what is everyone else doing with this intelligence? And when it leads to an outcome, whether it's for a population, let's say a school, a COVID outbreak in a local jail, or whether it's for an entire state deciding to do a stay-at-home order, those outcomes, it's very difficult to track in time frame that matters. What is the result of that outcome? So if a state issued a stay-at-home order, or if a whole school shut down because of measles suspects, or if Home Depot decided, you know what, we're going to provide free flu vaccination clinics, what impact did that outcome have on that population? And how can we make an iterative feedback loop so that the outcomes feed right back into data? This was my obsession as a local and state health officer, because we're only as good as tracking our outcomes and learning and getting better. Healthcare is very good at this. If you're using a new drug that treats congestive heart failure, we're very good at studying how those drugs work. But for populations and for risk management, the tools are less robust. This quote always makes me smile, and I think it applies to COVID, because what we saw in the United States was a total systems failure. The inability of our siloed systems, and I include all of us, across government, across private sector, schools, our nonprofits, our churches, that oftentimes care for the most vulnerable. Those humans are amazing. But the system failed. And so no matter how amazing our humans are and how good our heart motives are and our education is and how smart we are, the system will fail. And I'll be honest that that's what gives me hope. It sounds dreary, but the truth is, as I watched the systems fail, and I'll give you an example. In May of 2020, Governor Newsom had asked us, myself and Paul Markovich, who's the CEO of Blue Shield, to stand up a testing task force. There was no testing in California. We have 40 million people. We had about 2,000 PCR tests being done at the time in government labs. And Governor Newsom asked us to stand up a testing task force. What was amazing about that effort is it was kind of the ultimate startup. Within 6 weeks, we scaled from 2,000 tests a day to about 100,000. Within 8 weeks, we're at 120,000 tests a day. Now, that's for a population of 40 million, right? But how did we do that? Through manual work. We had whole teams. We had a call center that would call. We had about 400 different labs, and we were like the mafia, man. We would get swabs from anywhere. We were leveraging old machines, dusting them off, pulling them out. Across the state, it was a manual effort by a dedicated team from the private sector and from the public sector who were volunteering to do this. So did we pull it off and I don't want to say fix testing for California, but scale up to meet the needs? Yes, we did. I had so much hope in our humans after that. I had so much hope in what we can accomplish together, but you talk about a systems failure, because why was that a systems failure? I'm going to brag about California for a second. We have Silicon Valley. We have the smartest software developers in the world. We have platforms that have come out of Silicon Valley that have scaled globally, that operate at speed and scale. We have an incredible forward-leaning governor who is doing the right thing, putting resources towards it. We had the public or the private sector run to the fight. Why couldn't we do this better? Why couldn't we do this better? I was sick to my stomach over it, and that was May of 2020. And by June of 2020, this was the question I was asking. In light of this system's failure, which is not really a failure, it's what I call democracy debt. The U.S. public health system grew up organically out of the creation of the country. This isn't someone doing something wrong. It's just a result of our country growing fast. How do we provide for the common biodefense? I'm going to amend the Constitution a little bit, in light of that system. And so I started looking at constitutional quandaries, thinking about American culture and top-down mandate versus grassroots. What has worked in our country historically? So humor me for a moment because I want to talk about the Constitution. I have it right here. What I was looking at and thinking back through in my experience as a state health officer is in our federated system of states, we've got this dilemma in this thing. And the dilemma is states' autonomy and states' authority and provide for the common defense. How do we do that? The police powers for communicable disease are delegated to states. Well, in many states, those governors delegate them down to the local health officers. So we've got 3,200 phenomenal frontline teams, all with delegated authority to do whatever is necessary. The other part is, looking at providing for the common defense. What are models that work? What systems in our country have already been stood up? Can we look at FEMA? Can we look at fire? Can we look at the Federal Reserve? Are there examples that we have of systems that work? I build software now, and so I think of everything in terms of code and product requirement documents, and I think of the Constitution as the ultimate PRD. If there's anyone in this room that's ever built software, you'll get the joke. It's okay if you don't. This is an outline of what we're striving for. It's a high-level roadmap. It's a high-level architecture. Here's the goals. Here's what we need to be able to do. But the layered jurisdictional authority, or that delegated police power, is different in every state. It's even different for every disease. The delegated authority for police powers to contain a communicable disease is different for tuberculosis than it is for COVID. So it's not just different by state. It's not just different by jurisdiction. But we have what I would call a spaghetti code of overlapping, contradictory, and outdated, antiquated state laws, state regulations. That happened because, the first local health officer was Paul Revere in Boston. In the late 1700s, they had a cholera outbreak. And so stood up a board of health. Paul Revere was in charge. And ever since then, local health departments stood up just like that, organically, to meet the needs of the locals. And government formed around them. And then the states formed. And as the states started to move west, you can imagine this patchwork quilt started to come together. And so what we have today is simply still that. We've never sat down and strategically designed what would a system look like to provide for the common defense while ensuring the autonomy of states. The other thing is American culture. I issued health officer orders all of the time, mandated home isolation for a variety of diseases. But I'll tell you that mandated top-down health officer orders fly in the face of who we are as a country. And I understand that. And the dilemma is always to use the least restrictive measure. The dilemma is always, we as Americans, I think of us as rebels fighting for independence. We're not dragging cannons up Bunker Hill anymore. I took my kids to Boston over Thanksgiving break, and we went to see Bunker Hill and some of the Revolutionary War places. And they were amazed, like, wow, we stole the cannons from the British, and then we dragged them around and fired them back. And I think one of the reasons why they loved it, and there's a dark side to this kind of rebel independence, is because it's just the fabric of our country. It's who we are. The people want autonomy. People want independence. They don't want top-down mandates. And that's good. I think that's our strength. But how then do we provide for the common defense while ensuring individualism and autonomy and ensuring people's constitutional rights and not putting them in top-down mandates unless it's absolutely necessary? What is the solution there? So I think one of the lessons I learned during COVID, in March of 2020 when I was asked to sit down and write a plan for California, and I said I can't write one for California because we're connected to other states and this is out of containment, but I can write one for the United States. And so I sat down and wrote a tactical, practical, operational plan for the United States of America. You've never seen it because it wasn't implemented. But the principle, it went all the way up to the White House. I actually don't know what happened with it after that. But it was, the principle of the plan was simply this. Americans are going to revolt to mandates. Absolutely, we have to issue top-down mandates for a period of time. We have to use blunt instruments when we're flying blind. But the goal is to flip into surgical precision as fast as possible, because actually what people will do is they'll opt in to participate. If we call on the team spirit or the unity of the humans in our country, what we've seen time and time again is that people will rise to the occasion if they have visibility on the threat. But you can't see a virus. You can see a fire, but you can't see a virus. So without that shared visibility on the threat, it's really hard to get people to opt in. So the guiding principles for a solution, in light of that system, in light of how slow it moves, number one is speed. To have a chance at containment, and containment is the first goal, to have any shot at containment, our intelligence and our shared reality has to move faster than the virus. Now there's only one thing that I know of that goes viral faster than a virus, and that is intelligence in a networked platform. Yes, that can be used for evil. We have seen that in social media, but it can also be used for good. And what caught my interest during COVID was that rumors were going viral on Twitter faster than COVID was going viral, which meant the technology, the capability existed today to build something that moved fast. Scale. The ability to scale intelligence and decisions across millions of nodes in near real time. That's what we don't have today. All those nodes that I showed across all multi-sectors, there is no way to scale a shared response in real time. Resilience and autonomy. This is a foundational principle of any system that we build. And I'll make I statements here. I was politically appointed, so I served at the will of a board of supervisors as a local health officer, same as state health officer. Did you know every health officer, local, state, are all political appointees? So of course any level of response can be hijacked by political interests. It's the system that we have. That's just how the system was built. So how do we create the kind of shared visibility and operational response that would have autonomy, that couldn't be hijacked at any level? That's a real challenge for a whole of society response, right? Across public, across private. And I have to mention courage. You might say, why is that a guiding principle? You can't teach courage and you can't build software for it. I would argue that's true. Courage can't be taught, but courage can be modeled. And courage can be empowered through having the right decision-making tools. And what we saw in COVID and what I still see today is incredibly brave humans who want to do the right thing, but they need the tools at their fingertips in order to make the courageous decisions. So here are the 4 pillars of a biosecurity system solution for the United States. And this covers through an intelligence infrastructure, an operational infrastructure, an authority infrastructure, and trust. This covers governance, this covers constitutional state locality authority, it covers a shared visibility. One of the challenges with shared visibility is not everyone may opt to do the same thing. Like, let me just talk about the private sector. It's possible that the hotel industry may not respond in the same way as the airlines. That might be out of sync. Okay. But just having the same information at speed and at scale enables them to make decisions. Trust has to be a pillar of this. Trust, I always say, you can argue with me because I'm open to other perspectives, but trust, it's the very currency of public health. And as we watch the loss of trust in our public health institutions, we are in a dangerous place today. If COVID happened again right now, I don't even know that we'd respond as well as we did the first time because of the loss of trust. I would also argue it's a valid loss of trust. They watched the system fail. So how do we gain that back? Well, let me talk briefly about intelligence infrastructure. And again, full disclosure, the public health company is building this. We are 2 years in now to building this software. What are we really building? What does this really become? This becomes a public-private utility for all players, all actors on the platform. What I know for sure and what I've heard over and over from large companies, again, like airlines or places that you shop, the Costco's of the world, is that threat agnostic, the ability to have an intelligence platform that doesn't have to be re-engineered, that doesn't have to be rehacked for a new pathogen, for a new threat, that's what will let us go fast. So threat agnostic, multidimensional network effect. That means all players on board, data from healthcare, public health, private sector, employers, operates in real time. Predetermined threat levels, So a trigger goes off, an alarm goes off, it triggers a threat level in the platform. Automatically correlate with that, the choices you have, the decisions and the actions for that threat level. If it sounds like I'm talking about incident command, it's because I am. We have a lot to learn from fire. The fire sector, they figured this out in the 1970s, and they built systems with intelligence infrastructure where predetermined threat levels very quickly led to intelligence for shared visibility. And let me just mention, I won't get into genomics, but an intelligence infrastructure that enables characterization of the pathogen or threat from all the nodes in real time. How do you figure out the case fatality rate, the R0, the hospitalization rate, the incubation period, the infectious period, the component of asymptomatic spread, the mutations occurring? Does this next variant behave the same way as the last one? Is there vaccine escape? What's the efficacy of this vaccine against that variant? How do you do that over the phone, email, spreadsheets? Some of you might know better than I do because you're probably still enmeshed in it. Having a real-time data sharing place where that information was present would allow us to characterize these pathogens in near real time. And that's just, it's not possible today. It doesn't exist. I think of this as a global biosecurity platform. When I'm talking with my health colleagues, we talk about it as pathogen agnostic. When I'm talking with the chief security officers or chief risk officers of places like Home Depot, we talk about it as threat agnostic. The software platform, the entire goal, if I could summarize this in one sentence, which was also the theme of the premonition book, if you've read it, I would summarize it as this: systems built on human vigilance will always fail. But systems built on automation, with the tools that we now have available in Silicon Valley, the kind of machine learning platforms that have already been built, where alerts can go out and that vigilance of watching the world, that can happen in an automated fashion. That is a resilient system. Diverse global data. I love pathogens. My favorite is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. They're very predictable. We know what they do. We know how they walk and how they smell in general. But humans are the wild card. In communicable disease, what the crazy humans are doing, how we cross-pollinate, what policies we adhere to, where we move, who we spread it to, who we have sex with, who we eat with, what we smoke, who we breathe on, that's what drives disease. That's what drives communicable disease. And so while having data on the pathogens and characterizing the pathogen is lovely, that's actually a smaller component, that the ability to recognize these threats fast, we have to be able to characterize the human population and human movement. So when I talk about that, let me just break it down. Back to the concept of data turning into intelligence, turning into decisions and actions and outcome. What kind of data? Well, at the core of this has to be privacy and security. And we talk about this all the time. If you think about electronic medical record data or insurance billing data, but boy, when you start to think about mobility data from some of these social media platforms, when you think about how the sensitivity of the kind of data that's out there on you, on me, privacy and security has to be the foundation of anything, especially when you're dealing with health. Pattern recognition and pattern detection through AI and ML, algorithms and infrastructure. The ability to do that in the platform can replace the vast majority of the human vigilance. Decisions. Supporting decision makers amidst uncertainty means that this intelligence platform has to offer what decisions and choices exist and the evidence for them. Actions. I would have killed someone to be able to know what every other state health officer was doing. We had to do that on the phone. I don't know if any of you were in that situation, but in the heat of the moment, you got 2 minutes to make a decision and you just want to know, what are my colleagues doing? What are they considering? I don't want to be first, but I don't want to be last. I'm willing to be first if 20 others are going to follow. The ability to share in a shared visibility what others are doing or what they are considering. The ability to opt in to say, yes, I want to know what other state health officers are doing, or I'm head of HR for, make up a company, Home Depot. I would like to know, are the heads of HR for the other Fortune 500 companies, are they all considering implementing a mask mandate? And if I do this, will others be with me? And then tracking the outcomes. What was the result? Did it work? What was the cost? Was it worth it? So the shared reality of the intelligence platform, when I talk about it as a utility, that is really what I believe the country needs. And as we put our heads down to build it, I will say this is not impossible, but this is hard. Why doesn't it exist? Because it's really stinking hard. But the other reason why it doesn't exist, I believe, is I do not think that before COVID, we would have had the will, both from Fortune 500 companies, from the NGO sector, from academia, from government. I don't know that we would have had the will to build something like what we're building today. But there's a lot of will today. Operational infrastructure. Okay. I don't want to talk through all these words or all of the concepts here. I want to talk about fire. So the operational infrastructure of fire. Let me tell you a story about the Thomas Fire. So I was the local health officer in Santa Barbara, risk manager. And the Thomas Fire at the time, 2017, was the biggest fire we had ever seen in California. And it was December. Thanks to climate change, remember those intersecting threats? Thanks to climate change, we're seeing all kinds of natural disasters off cadence. We shouldn't have that kind of wildfire in December. When it first lit on the hill, the local fire chief notified the other fire chiefs around him, and immediately a unified incident command was formed, where they have a unified command with the locals, the regionals. Because there's shared visibility of the fire, as it expanded, mutual aid showed up. Mutual aid showed up because you hit a risk level, and by design, mutual aid came. The local fire chief could decide to do more, but could not opt out of fighting that fire. Why? Because we could all see it. So if he said, yeah, this fire is a hoax, I do not believe it exists, Ventura was going to burn to the ground. San Luis Obispo was going to burn to the ground. So the key for fire during the Thomas Fire is the shared visibility. The shared visibility leads to a shared operational infrastructure that's automatically triggered, that leads to mutual aid showing up for those predetermined threat levels. The centralized capabilities that they have in unified command, it's a very defined set of capabilities. It's not an overreach, and it is for that certain threat level that they have authority to act, to put out this fire. So fire has taught me a ton about the kind of infrastructure that I believe we need. I believe that the key core infrastructure for the United States is an operational infrastructure that does not exist. Now, I put ASPR at the top of this. Anyone can argue about who's in charge. I don't know the answer to that, but we'll say ASPR for now. ASPR is the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. It sits under Health and Human Services at the federal level. These are the folks that they send out with tents. They deploy out to do stuff in the field, and they're very good at it. An operational response that has in unified command CEOs right next to the National Guard, that has the airlines, those that have skin in the game, the private sector CEOs, again, I'll pick on Home Depot or Costco, in unified command with the others in government responsible. That's actually how fire works. When a fire happens, it's not just the fire chiefs. It's those that have a lot to lose. It's those that have skin in the game that are making the decisions. So analogs for this exist. They exist in fire. They exist in FEMA. They also exist in the Federal Reserve. One of the questions I've had is, again, back to the polarization of politics and how do we create a system that cannot be hijacked at any level by political interests. The Federal Reserve has done something interesting where if we create this kind of umbrella operational infrastructure, considering the appointment of the leaders as longer terms, 7 terms, 14-year terms, although they might be appointed by a POTUS and they might have their own political interests, they really are operating for the common defense. And this becomes a decision-making group. You can't make decisions for United Airlines, but this becomes a decision-making group of what is the level of crisis based on the shared reality in the intelligence platform. What we saw during COVID was a circus. If you haven't read this paper, I highly recommend it. It just came out, American Democracy and Pandemic Security, from our friends at Brown and at CSIS and at the COVID Collaborative. This paper, and I love these folks, they're close thought partners, talks about the circus that we've experienced of who is in charge. I'm still not sure. Who was in charge? Was it the states in charge? Was it the White House? Was it CDC? Was it ASPR? I'll tell you my experience after 2.5 years of heartfelt conversations with business leaders. They were left to fend for themselves. And these businesses, these are our neighbors. We talk about essential workers. Well, where do you think they all work? And do you think that the CEO of that corporation knew what actions to take to protect his workers? No. They don't have epidemiologists. They don't have infectious disease doctors. They can't infer from early studies that this is airborne. They've got nothing. They've got nothing. And that's what inspired me to think through. And again, White House has been close thought partners to me. This is mine wholly, totally independent. But the conversations with ASPR, with BARDA, with HHS, with the amazing humans at CDC, the amazing humans across government, my friends that ran Operation Warp Speed, we cannot escape the conclusion that this has to be a public-private partnership. We can't do this with just government alone again. Okay, this is my favorite topic, so I'm only going to say 2 sentences. The layered jurisdictional authority of the United States of America must be a pillar in this plan. Why? Because the goal of the authority infrastructure, the goal in our patchwork quilt, should be to make the right decision to have the right decisional authority at the right level with the right position and under the right conditions, so that decision makers are empowered, even in a patchwork quilt system, to do the right thing. Might be different from Louisiana to Alabama. Right now what we have is a relic of the past 2 centuries, contradicting, overlapping statutes and regulations. There are solutions. I am not an attorney. I do have opinions. If there's anyone in the room that is an attorney, I want to ask you a few questions when we get to Q&A. But a future state of our country will have to contemplate, how do we align and resolve the layered jurisdictional authority? What are the options that we could put in place? My job as a tech CEO building the intelligence platform is to say, what if it never changes? Okay, what if this is the reality? Can we build a system despite the layered jurisdictional authority? Right? The Paul Revere's of the world, that's still how it's done. And trust. It is devastating to see what has happened to trust in public health. When I talk about these issues, I talk about them as biodefense or biosecurity, because public health today is kind of a misnomer. Public health is not disease control. Public health is really risk management across intersecting physical world threats. Population, infrastructure. Is the electrical grid public health? You betcha it is public health. So biodefense or biosecurity is a larger umbrella that people understand, and is a larger umbrella for the kind of threats the country faces. This is way beyond government public health. I want to hear others' thoughts when we open it up for questions of, in a democracy, because that's the challenge, right? In a democracy, how do we provide for the common defense? In a democracy, how do we have a shared visibility so that citizens, organizations, humans opt into the response? When I was running the testing task force, and we had just started it, and it was a circus because there were only a few of us, and the governor went into a press conference and announced that California was standing up the testing task force. It was me and Paul Markovich, who quickly assembled a team and assembled a plan. And we started getting phone calls in from people all across the state. And my favorite phone call was a guy from Los Angeles. I think he was somewhere right outside of Los Angeles County. And the stay-at-home orders had been issued. Businesses were shut down. And he said, I have a taco truck, and I have a lot of supplies, and I have a few people that work for me. How can you use it? How can I help? I've got trucks, I've got people. There's no one to sell them to because everything's shut down and everyone's at home. And we didn't have a place to plug that guy in. We didn't have a place to plug in the private sector. It was very difficult to plug in volunteers. In the incident command structure that FIRE uses, there absolutely is a place to plug in volunteers. And if we had a shared intelligence, the guy with the taco truck would know exactly what the risk was and where to plug in. I felt like the trust of the humans, our amazing people on the ground, was really built by transparency and visibility. And the more transparent we are, the more transparent I was in my role as a public servant, and in my role today with the software we're building, the more transparent and honest we are, the more we earn trust. And that means sharing what we don't know. It means the willingness to say, we're going to share what our level of confidence is, we're going to share what we don't know. I don't know how we earn back trust in our public health authorities. I don't know if we can, I'll be honest, looking at the political divisions today. But I'm very curious to hear others' thoughts. As we've put this together and as I've worked on this kind of infrastructure over the last 2 years, I'll tell you, I don't have all the answers. I'm just one person who's experienced this, the pandemic, along with everyone else. But I've been doing public health and disease control for 24 years in a lot of different places, a lot of different cultures. And I don't think that it will be any one person's framework or idea or operational plan that becomes the answer for the country. But I do believe that all of us can put that together, that those that have experienced it can consider these ideas, for improvement, for consideration, for iteration. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing is going out and talking to people, including, building the intelligence platform. What matters to the people on the front lines? What do they care about most? It's strange to jump from being a doctor into being a tech CEO. But it's the same, going to where people's pain is. Go right to where the pain is. What hurts the most? How do we solve that? And when you solve for someone's problem where they are, right where they are, whether it's in software or in a clinic room, that's when you earn trust. So I believe this is possible. I believe all of this is possible. And I've committed my life to doing it, whatever that looks like. So the adventure continues. And I thank you for your time. And I would love questions. I would love to hear your perspective, your thoughts. Can we regain trust? What would an operational infrastructure look like in light of the experiences that you've had? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Charity. Let's open for questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Doc. Excellent lecture. So just to kind of summarize it, really what you're speaking about, and I hate to use this term, but it's almost like a social media for people involved in public health to be able to get information at an instant to connect all those nodes. Correct?
Yeah, I think it's a fair metaphor. Someone said a Twitter for biosecurity.
Okay.
So
That's what I was thinking.
it's not entirely accurate, but that absolutely the underlying capabilities are very similar. Shared intelligence.
Yeah, a couple comments. One of them was like, so, when you're trying to bring a system together like this, usually the biggest challenge is the different stakeholders who are willing to share data. Because you don't have a system unless you actually have that data that can actually become your intelligence and actually inform your decision making. So as I think about that in the health specific world, I'll contrast that where we do that really well in law enforcement. So in law enforcement, you actually have better sharing of data. So on a need-to-know basis, from the Federal Bureau to NSA to the local police to the county health department, in a moment's notice, they can get whatever information that they need on a particular individual who may be a threat. And I think it's important when you were talking about the framing of it, when you're talking about the framing of security, because it's that basis that allows all those different levels, all those layers, those jurisdictional layers, to be willing to share information. Not everybody has the same access. Not everyone has the same access. If I am a state, maybe a law enforcement official, I will have access to local information. I'll have access maybe to the state. I may get information that's shared with me from the federal level, but that level of those systems, they are disparate systems, but they are actually integrated in a way where they are interoperable.
Yeah.
And so then at that point, really the main thing that matters is the willingness to put that data in. The law enforcement, they do that. And it's on a need-to-know basis. Based upon maybe your level and what you actually have, you may have access to everything, and whether that's CDC maybe data or whether that is from immigration, whatever. Health data, we don't do that. Even though we have more than enough reasons for why we should share that information, we don't do it. In our setting right now, where we are in with the Connecticut Department of Corrections, starting there, I just remember one of the cultural changes. Our custody colleagues will tell us, safety and security first. I said, well, no, it's not safety and security, it's about the patient. Then when I think back about on that, because part of my my clinical experience is actually doing urgent care and walk-in and doing occupational medicine. And even when you're trained about, doing a code, and you're trained about, revising someone, out in the community, safety and security first. The safety piece is like, don't try to revive someone if you see there's electrical coils and there's a fire. Safety first. So I think the idea about the biosecurity, framing it from a security perspective, I think that will make it better to have more folks share information as they need to. Couple of things also that I was thinking too is like when you're talking about your Federal Reserve model and why is that successful? One of the reasons why I think that's successful is because it is decentralized. It's not based in Washington, D.C. It's not based in Atlanta. And it most certainly isn't really based in Wall Street. They actually have different representatives from all over the country at different locations. And so they meet. And so you sort of have, if you will, like it's not the perception, but also maybe the culture and the political views that you actually have. That's more of that, if you will, that quilt that you were showing on your image. From the West, from the East, from the Midwest. So I think that's important. As I think about health and I think about when we think about the CDC, well, we think about Atlanta. We don't think about the broader country. And so part of having that trust is if you decentralize it, both state and at the local level. And you have representatives from those different layered jurisdictions who are collectively contributing to that input and that decision making and the weighing. I love the point where you sort of said, well, you may share the data instantaneously, but someone who's running a hotel chain may be on a different time scale in terms of their action as opposed to someone who's running airlines, as opposed to someone who's running the government. For me, I'm working for the state like right now, but previously I was a local health officer. The city of New Haven and also Monroe County. Worked in the State Department of Public Health as well. So I've seen that layer and then also worked in the state legislature in California as well. So I've seen those different layers of different stakeholders, and I've seen the territorialness that folks may have, right or wrong. But I think to your point, that's not something that's bad. That's part of our American culture. That's part of our American framework, our backbone. So we should embrace that rather than denying it or trying to pretend like it doesn't matter. I'm reminded of there's one cartoon from the New York Times where they showed public health having folks kind of in a tube hooked up and everybody being exercised, getting the perfect meal, but we would never go for that in this country, even if it meant that you were going to have a better outcome that way because it would defeat our sense of freedom. So I think that matters a lot, and so I will also say in Monroe County, for those of you who don't know, a lot of your urban metro centers are, it's not rocket science to say that most of those are pretty liberal. On the other hand, county government, not so much. Because county government oftentimes is either more rural, or you might have, that piece that's more conservative from a philosophical perspective. So with county government, you usually tend to have a split where it tends to favor maybe more of a conservative, lifestyle. And yet as a county health official that I was in Monroe County, I have to worry about those different components within my jurisdiction, which include the central city, but also my affluent suburbs, but also my rural localities. So being able to sort of interact maybe with those different stakeholders and speak to them in a language that you can sort of, again, build that trust that you're talking about.
I love that. Thank you.
I think it was very, very good. And one of the things that makes me think about is, like, what does it look like to contain a fast-moving pathogen? And I think a big part of it is thinking about why is it hard in the first place, and part of it probably is related to trust. And then you think about why is trust a problem, and it's that the whole communication, it's the whole transparency sort of aspect of it. And so one question that I would love to get input on is, so how do you strike a balance between managing public reactions to information, and also communicating the perfect exact information, which I think leads to delays, which I think also leads to people feeling as though governments and public officials are leaving things out. I feel like the direction we should be headed is to not do that. Say what we know, what we don't know, confidence levels, etc. So what does striking that type of balance look like? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Any takers?
Anyone had that dilemma during COVID? Can you summarize again in one sentence? Striking the balance between transparency of sharing information.
Yeah. We know that there are risks associated with like not having 100% like correct information, but sometimes it could be at a 90% mark, right? So how do you strike that balance between saying communicating at 90% with confidence, right? Stating what you know, what you don't know, and managing like public reaction. That's kind of the question.
I think you nailed it. That's the police. I mean, I'm going to go back, to a really good example that we had historically at that time, 9/11. So then we had Mayor Giuliani at the time. His comments that he gave every single day, it was brilliant. He always started off, this is what we know. This is what we don't know, this is what we're working on, and then this is when we're going to meet again. I mean, that's been used in public health, but also others in terms of how you communicate information in a way that people can understand. You said this is what we know, this is what we don't. So you're actually sort of, you're managing expectations.
That's I think, really solid.
I think too, maybe like explaining better what uncertainty and doubt mean in these contexts, because I think like as scientists or public health officials, like you think of them differently than the average American would. So like making them realize that that's built into it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong.
And I think that goes along with toward like transparency as well, and then you can get additional input. So I think that's a solid point.
I personally, I think, because I was in Korea actually during the pandemic, so I've seen how transparency can also be bad. Because in Korea, they were being very transparent, but to the point where they were oversharing information. Because we share like contact tracing information just like publicly. Like I would get texts when I was in Korea, and they'll be like, oh, like this person, like 40-year-old like woman, they've been to like these stores. So like if you've been to these stores, be careful. And that could like create like a public like. People would just panic. Like if you've been like even near that area, that would just like really ruin businesses like in the neighborhoods. So I think also like what level of data shared, like what level of transparency is okay was something that Korean government like I think had to like really learn from and just like continue to evolve. Yeah.
Is that on the delivery side of things though, because they did very similar things in New Zealand, but they did the same things that they had the daily briefings of again, this is what we know, this is what we're doing. So maybe it's that balance between how much you're sharing, but what you are, how you're delivering it, so that you don't create that sort of panic around it.
And I think based off of that, that kind of plays into this idea of we're paying a lot more attention to what we consider good science communication now, but we haven't actually defined what good science communication is. So if we provide a better definition for that, then I think we can create a better infrastructure for defining, providing general health information to the public, pandemic reactions, continued information spread, as well as those sort of definitions will provide us the structure to be able to define and give information to be like, hey, like this 90% confidence interval means this, and this can change, but this does not mean we're providing you with faulty information. This means we are limited in current knowledge and we are still continuing to expand. Because I think in a lot of ways, while we're doing our best to, in layman's terms, dumb things down for the better population, we're still thinking from a brain of a science community and assuming that by dumbing it down to the smallest bit of that means that we are at the common level, but that is not necessarily true because that's still assuming some science background, some basic knowledge, some basic interpretation.
Sure,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great segue. Like, what do CEOs think about that? Right? Because
Yay.
you're absolutely right, right? Because
Yeah.
science. Well, CEOs don't think science, right? And when I say CEOs, people in charge of running organizations, could be NGOs, could be academia, and so on.
It's been so humbling to jump. So I jumped from running the pandemic response for California into launching a private tech startup and spent 2 years talking to C-suite, CEOs, chief operating officers, heads of HR in enterprises. What was remarkable is their worries are the same. No one is coming to save them, and they have no tools, and they have scattered data streams. But they do not want to see the word pathogen in any of the content. They don't know what that is. I could say virus. What resonates more is threat agnostic. So I have learned to speak in the love language. I love this metaphor. Anyone read The 5 Languages of Love? So great. I have learned to speak in their love language, that what CEOs want is tell me what's actually going on the ground and tell me what the risk is to my assets. Give me a heads up if there's something I can do about it, and then tell me what everyone else is doing. Done in 30 seconds. And so I have learned, it's been so humbling, the communication for the private sector leaders. And recent surveys have shown that the American public, you look at the trust index, they trust enterprise CEOs more than government officials. I'm not saying if that's good or bad, maybe that's good at times, depending on who's in charge. They trust enterprise CEOs more. And so the kind of content that we write for the decision makers over a supply chain in a car auto manufacturing plant, that content has to be, what's happening, what's the risk, what can I do? Just tell me real simple. And so I've cleaned my vocabulary of things like pathogen or molecular evolution or even variant to speak in their language. And what's really cool is similar to fire or police or any other security sector, any other security ecosystem. The language might be slightly different, but their underlying needs are the same. They all want the same thing.
Come on, just going to pressure test. This is a really important issue because you're talking about metrics, right?
Yeah.
You can't measure it. You can't manage it if you can't measure it.
Exactly.
So what do we mean by trust, right? And we're just kind of two pressure tests on that. One is that wasn't it scientists during all kind of the polls, right? With I think validated measures of trust. Wasn't the scientists like the highest during the pandemic?
Yeah, they were close to the highest. I screenshotted that. Yeah, because I love that.
So the president, politicians, they were all, you're setting a false straw man argument because the politicians, anyone's going to be higher than
Fair.
politicians. But
Fair.
I think it was the scientists. I'm not sure, but it does raise the issue of the metric. Right? What is the metric for trust? Let me just say that on the opposite is that countries did a much better job than the United States. We've used the word evidence, trust, and science, right? In many different ways. But social norms were very important. Right? We don't like using words like disincentives, right, or shame, or but those played a big role in countries that New Zealand included. Right? It's interesting. We have New Zealand, we have Korea, we have different countries here. But so I'm just going to throw those out as pressure testing the idea of the importance of trust and the importance of we all agree. This is but just and what's the metric?
I think the kind of idea of that too is then, as we're thinking about this, who should be delivering this information then? How should it be being delivered? Who should be the primary authorship of this? Depending on who we're talking to as well, because we, I think, sometimes pressure ourselves to have one metric for communication for everyone, but that's not necessarily the way that works. Like you said, you've been speaking the love language of the CEOs that you've been starting to interact with to best get them to understand your point. So then how do we create an infrastructure to break that down to the proper sources communicating with others to increase that level of trust and also to help us understand and better define what that metric exactly is depending on the community.
I love the concept of social norms. You're right, that's a way better, nicer way of putting it.
Just maybe just interject. Let's look back at monkeypox and Ebola. There was something that happened that was much, had a much bigger impact, right? Effectiveness than vaccines or even you could say medical care, right? In terms of the shape of that curve. I'm sorry, Mark.
No. I was just going to say, I think for me what really stands out is that it's not just about communicating accurately, but also counteracting misinformation. It seems to be such a huge thing that we're dealing with in medicine or the public health sector these days. And how do you deal with, exactly what you were saying, certain enterprises which are not only not doing a good job of conveying the information that you want, but actively counteracting your efforts to get through to people. People trust. They have trust in something. They have trust in their total misbeliefs sometimes, and it's really sad to watch. I don't know how to get at that. It's something I struggle with a lot, but I appreciate the conversation around this. It's interesting to me that people will trust their car mechanic as an expert, but they will not trust their medical doctor as an expert anymore. Somewhat related to the amount of information that we can get when Googling. I mean, I can't really Google how to fix my car, but I can Google enough to kind of, or people can Google enough to have an idea of what might be going on with them on a health level. But I don't have answers to these things, but I really struggle with like the misinformation. And how do you even incorporate that into your modeling? Sort of the fact that a lot of people are acting like completely counterintuitively to what would be best for their own health outcomes.
Just to back Morgan up, so we are probably one of the nidus's of misinformation here at Yale and in Connecticut. The whole line, I mean, let's not invoke pandemics or epidemics. The whole issue about Lyme disease and chronic Lyme, and the interests of home IV therapies, in propagating. So it all started here about 30 years, 40 years ago.
I didn't know that.
Some of our senators also have been active in that propagation of misinformation. We have in seminars, we have speakers where the activists come in here and shout down the, so this is without even having to evoke pandemics or epidemics. And you've seen that.
Yeah.
In the wards.
So are you currently selling something? And if so, what are they buying? Like when you approach a CEO or a health department or something, I'm curious to know sort of what your kind of intellectual property is, whether you're selling an expertise with a network of experts, or are you selling something concrete that they can sort of take ownership of and adapt to their setting?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And I would use selling lightly because they're paying, obviously, we have customers that pay us, but these founding customers are really our design partners. I would argue we get way more learning from them. So we are selling software. This is software as a service. It's a software platform. Many of our customers want the experts as well. So they want a layer of consulting services, which has taught me that these business decision makers, their safety blanket is a relationship with the domain expert. They will trust the intelligence in software when they know the experts behind it. Sometimes they just want to buy the software. They're using it for business continuity, risk visibility, risk management. One thing that surprised me is that the CEOs, we keep hearing this, are using it for brand reputation and trust. By their employees knowing that they're using the public health company software and talking to our experts, their employees have greater trust in the decisions the CEO is making, because he or she can say, this is public health company, this is third-party, agnostic, non-political, these are not political appointees, it's just based on science and data. And oh, by the way, let's get you on the platform so you can see it too. And that shared visibility and the trust in a third party has enabled them to implement things like masking policy, like flu season mandates, that without that, they were really struggling. They were struggling with, the internal wars and employees revolting and how can we trust what you're telling us to do. What they've shared with me is that there has been such a loss of trust in the CDC and federal agencies and government leadership that employees look to the CEO and they want to know those decisions are being made on science. So what we sell is the software and a layer of consulting experts, but it sounds like what we're really selling is trust and expertise at scale. That's what they want.
And are they inputting information? One of the things that really struck me about your presentation is your comment that you would be willing to make a decision. It would help you feel more comfortable with a decision if you knew that 20 of your peers were also sort of moving in the same direction and thinking about the same thing. Does it work in both directions? Meaning, if my company is part of this, am I inputting data that can then be used by you to help provide additional information or build your kind of foundational knowledge?
Yes, and that's part of the multidimensional network effect. We call it benchmarking. It's just very simply the ability, if you were sharing your data with the software, it's your choice what you share. It's your choice at what level you share it. It's your choice if you share it with certain peers or certain sectors at what level. But what the software is able to do is to mimic that process of what are the 20 chief risk officers who have warehouses in India doing about this acute heat event? Are they shutting down? Are they sending people home? They do that right now through phone calls and emails. And so because we do ingest information from customers, you can imagine how much more valuable the software is to the customers when they plug into it, upload their data, and see the intelligence back in light of their global footprint, their policies, their demographics, their humans. And that's where it starts to get really powerful. But back to the rebels fighting for independence, that has to be opt-in. It's all opt-in. Yeah.
So thinking about some of the things earlier, connecting a couple of these things, we were talking about like decentralization, so the collective manpower. So what we've been doing with Aside Direct is, I think one of the most inspiring things that I didn't expect to come out of it was that we've got this network of geographically diverse laboratories around the country. We've designated over 200 labs. We have an extended network of about over 750 laboratory partners who have connected with us in some way. We connect with them, we set up testing programs. And it has been my dream, amongst many other things, the last 3 years, is to be getting more of this real-time testing data from them. And, we've talked to the labs, they're very excited about actually sharing the data. We've talked to them, like, do they actually have the authority to share their data into some, more public databases, and this idea that, end of the day, end of the week, they could be uploading their data. We could have this geographically diverse dashboard or something, but limited bandwidth, expertise, and resources has not seen this happen yet. But then thinking about exactly what Michael was saying about how, the model that you're presenting is that the users of this is kind of like the customers, so that they are getting something from it themselves, and at the same turn, they're uploading their information to it. So if you were to take, say, this network of labs who have been very collaborative, they're really, really wanting to sort of do whatever they can. They're seeing what happens when they work collectively, because they used to work in silos. They didn't have this. So if they were using your platform in terms of like uploading their data to you, what is it that at the laboratory level that they would actually be getting back as the customer as well? Do you think?
Yeah. So we're not working with laboratories as a use case yet. However, in the very beginning, the very first version of software that we built was genomic epidemiology to characterize the variants as they emerged in time and space. And I know that's possible. I believe that's possible. So for the laboratories, what I would imagine the use case for the laboratories is simply a place to go to upload the data, select, configure what data you want to share with your colleagues, at what level. There's probably some aggregate de-identified level that is acceptable. And how you want that configured. Do you want all the laboratories to be able to see it? You only want certain laboratories? Back to the analogy from the police, that the access controls, right? Based on your level of seniority or access, there might be different visibility. So simply uploading the laboratory data to have a God view in one place, is step one. The reason I built it as a modularized platform is to have different modules with different stuff, early warning, threat visibility, laboratory information, healthcare system information, guidance tools. So we haven't built out laboratories yet, but I thought a lot about it in the beginning, because in order to characterize a novel pathogen, step one is all the laboratories have to be on the same shared intelligence platform. And I know it's possible. But the other piece, back to like data, intelligence, decisions, actions, outcomes, how do you characterize a novel pathogen? Well, you need the clinical outcomes. So you need not just the phylogeny and genomic epi and sequence, but then you need the healthcare clinical information on that patient and the clinical outcome. And that's how you start to characterize it in real time, right? I dream of a day when publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine 9 months later, it's so 1992. I dream of a day when we have the kind of shared software visibility that's opt-in for all the nodes in the network, that we could characterize a novel pathogen very quickly. by having that data uploaded.
Yes, I can certainly see that the laboratories would be a key component to this, and in fact, for all your other users in terms of, as you're talking about, knowing what your local risks are. Although like we could have mask mandates, we could think about, hey, we've seen an uptick of cases this week, and a lot of wastewater monitoring is doing that now, but the fact that you could be getting a lot of other interesting, because we were only really looking at SARS-CoV-2, but we were like, even if there was an increase in demand for SARS-CoV-2 tests, even if the percentage of them is there's no uptick in positivity, it's sort of indicating that there's other symptomatic events going on in the community that's driving this testing behaviour. So that's what we're sort of key of, like, hey, we've seen this uptick in demand for testing. Is it, going on the early outbreak of flu or RSV that we haven't captured, or should we be looking into this further as well?
Mm-hmm. The first time I started envisioning this platform was for a laboratory use case. It was around 2014, and I was running an MDR-TB outbreak with this wacko codon mutation in TB, with the RPOB gene, where it flipped from rifampin sensitive to rifampin resistance at some point during treatment. And I needed to know, where was this codon in the United States? Who else had it? So my wall was covered in sticky notes, yellow stickies, tracking this RPOB mutation down to Oaxaca, across California, there's one in Mississippi. And I thought, my God, if we could just upload the lab results into one place and it could autofill a map. I don't need to know names, addresses. This is not, I just want to follow that mutation. And that's when I realized, the electronic laboratory system, with the progress that's been made, it's possible. It's possible. So it's a use case. We just haven't developed it yet.
We have plenty of partners potentially if you are.
Okay.
One thing is I thought about your question about what benefit do the labs get. Some of that benefit may just be some of the visualization and the other patterns with other data that you have that you can sort of feed back to the labs. And part of the reason why I think about that, as a local health officer, as you mentioned before, we report to stuff to the state all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we reported stuff moving to the state, and yet the state had very sophisticated systems that could actually take that data at the local level, transform it, and give you more information. And yet a lot of times we could not, at least here in Connecticut, it was very difficult to get that information back at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to actually have that capability, in order to have that information at the local level, we had to do duplicate effort.
So in other words, you would send it to the state, and it was unidirectional into
Correct.
the darkness of the void, and you didn't.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Same.
And then then they had a system, but in order to actually access that system for data that we sent you, I, as a health officer, would actually have to write a very specific letter requesting not access to the data, but for them to do the reports. And I just thought that was crazy. I was like, wow. Coming from New York, where it's like we would put the information to the system that we still could visualize and then manipulate it.
So some of that problem, and just to interject, so some of that problem here in Connecticut is that I think, of the, how many public health directors, maybe
Oh, Lord.
70 public health directors, I think one has a MPH
Yeah.
in Connecticut, the 70 municipalities.
You had everybody give me that.
At,
The last.
Yeah.
at the state capitol in the PH, they're using antiquated. The problem here, I think, is not just informatics; it's the analytics. Is it for somebody to generate a report for you in New Haven over the department? That's why we work together. But
Yeah.
To work for the Department of Corrections, they'll probably have to take somebody off just to run. And these are people who probably don't know a lot about R.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit of SAS, and probably doing everything from Excel spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
Probably take 2 or 3 days to generate that data for you. So that's the kink. So there's two parts. The one is the informatics, and you can imagine where we would be if we didn't have the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, without that investment in EMR. But the second problem is the analytics, right?
Absolutely.
And that's probably the excuse you got. And I'm probably sure it's the same. In California, you probably did it for yourself, all that analysis.
No.
But if you had to ask
We didn't
somebody,
even have an epidemiologist.
Yeah. But at the state capitol, they probably, what's the reason why you would never get the data back? Is because maybe they had good intentions to do it, but they didn't have somebody to.
Yeah.
They could take off their already busy schedule to
Yeah.
do that.
And I would again summarize that is the reason why didn't the locals get it back? Well, timely if ever. because it was all being compiled by human vigilance and human domain experts, as opposed to, I mean, I know now, software can take over 90% of that. You've got to build it, and it's expensive and resources. So what we've heard from local health officers is, can I just plug into it, upload my data, and see, run it through the tools? You got a workbench right there, see the analytics and everything right there. I don't need a data scientist. I don't need an epidemiologist, although ideally they'd have one. And play with it, slice and dice the data myself.
Well, you have definitely an epidemiologist desert here in Connecticut, right? In terms of the local, many places in the United States.
Yeah.
Which is,
But that's what's amazing. Isn't it mind-blowing? Think of the largest private company you know. I'll pick on Costco. They want the same thing. They don't have any epidemiologists or data. Well, they have data scientists do other things, but the ability to plug in their data, have a workbench of analytics, and get intelligence back that has more of a God view.
but there are systems that do work. And I think you mentioned the correctional facility, but the other is, correct me if I'm wrong, food security.
Food, yeah.
Right. And this is more, we don't learn this because this is more veterinary. Our students don't learn this because it's more veterinary public health. But correct me if I'm wrong, there are very sophisticated ways of tracking disease among livestock, but also tracking and sharing that information. But also when it goes, sampling, food sampling, and then looking at signals or batches of roast beef that get shipped out, or ground meat, that get shipped out. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's true. It's
and that's all private. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's cool about what I've learned is looking at incentives, right? Why is that? It's because their revenue depends on it. So it's a pretty big financial hit, revenue loss, if a whole batch goes out the window. Also,
But there's also, because there's regulations.
Also there's regulations, but also because it's animals and food. So you don't have HIPAA and privacy and some of those issues we deal with humans.
Okay, right. Fair point. But it does exist for for human safety. Right?
Yeah, and it's pretty sophisticated. Yeah.
So you can track, let's say, for example, if there's an E. coli 157H7 that has a hit on a hamburger meat, there's like many cows or many beef that go into the cattle that go into a hamburger. So they can trace that back to where all that was distributed within 3 or 4 days. It's still, it doesn't really work with vegetables as well as it does with meat, but there are those tracking systems. Right?
The analytics piece, this came up, for our agency participated in these statewide meetings called the Transparency Council. So I was just, I was telling Bob, I was on that like last week. And so it was interesting. So with this, they're looking at, healthcare quality. So you have DSS, or Department of Social Services, which oversights our Medicaid for the state. So they have a huge budget, much larger than ours, much larger than DPH's. And so they have these different data sources, from public agencies, other state agencies, but also from the private sector. And so they said, well, in terms of being able to sort of show this data, one of it is, getting the MOUs so that data can be shared with other sister agencies. But they said, even if we had the data, we don't have the analytics and the clinical informatics expertise in-house. And they said, that's not trivial. So they said, even if we had all the data, it would still take us time to sort of pull that together to make it useful information that they put on their dashboard that they were talking about last week. So that piece about, the analytical and the informatics and stuff is not insignificant, even when you do get access to the data. So at a state level and at a local level, that's probably a value add.
I have a suggestion. Fran set up wine and cheese and beer outside. I would suggest this is a great discussion, but first of all, I think we should transfer this and we can drink, have this discussion over wine and cheese and beer and so forth. But second, just to give our heartfelt appreciation to charity. Let's carry it out. But I like the comment. Have you ever seen the line? Our Senator Blumenthal is
worthy partner.
Wait, say that again?